Once again, the National Broadcasting Company delays its regular programs to bring you another first-hand report of the tense situation in Europe. In Paris at this moment is William Hillman of Collier's. In the NBC newsroom in New York is John Gunther, author of Inside Asia and Inside Europe. Mr. Gunther, will you start?
Good evening, everybody. I'm talking from the NBC newsroom. In a moment, we're going to take you over to Paris. Meantime, let me say what everybody knows, that today has been one of the most trying days in modern history. Today we have seen a new act in the plunge of Europe from Sitzkrieg to Blitzkrieg, from sitting down war to lightning war. The Germans, it seems to me, have gained enormously, so far as we can tell now, by their occupation of Denmark and their occupation of Norway. They have the butter and fat and eggs of Denmark at their disposal. They have landing fields now for airplanes in Denmark, close to England. They may soon be in a position to establish submarine bases in Norway. They already have 5 or 6 ports in Norway on the Atlantic, close to Great Britain. Though whether or not they can hold them is another matter. They've gained great domestic prestige. They're threatening the Balkans. Above all, they're in a better position now, if they can hold it, to beat the British blockade than they've ever been before. Now it's the Allies' turn to do something quickly. This is a major defeat for the Allies, unless they act at once. If Norway goes the way the other small countries have gone, the blow may turn out to be a disaster. Germany is no longer a prisoner behind the West Wall or a prisoner in the Baltic. But what can the British and French do? Unless the Norwegians get help quickly, they're almost bound to have to submit to superior German force, and this might lead to a complete German conquest of Scandinavia. Of course, one might say that today's events also show a weakness in Germany. They show that Germany cannot endure passive warfare, that the blockade is effective, that the Nazis do need that Swedish iron. Now I want to carry you to Paris. There are a great many questions we're very eager to have answered. We'll talk with Paris for a moment. Are you there, Bill Hillman?
Hello, John Gunther.
Hello.
Hello, John.
I want to ask you half a dozen questions, Bill.
Go ahead, John.
We're in the dark about a great deal over here. Maybe you can help enlighten us in this extremely drastic situation. First, I'd like to ask, did the Allies know for sure that the Germans were massing ships on the Norwegian coast before the Allies laid their mines? You know, Bill, Mr. Chamberlain said today that it was quite incorrect to assume that the Germans launched their Scandinavian attack in retaliation for this new Allied minefield. He said that German preparations for their attack must have taken a long time. What do you think, Bill?
Yes, John. You will find that the Allies certainly did have some knowledge of German activity. Diplomatic circles had been busied with rumors for many days of German troop ships in the Baltic headed west. Certainly even many days before the mines were laid by the Allies. Allied authorities must have been and certainly were aware for some time of German plans.
But, Bill, if the British knew about German plans, why didn't they do something about it? After all, if they knew that those ships and so on were massing there, why didn't they try to take action? After all, they're presumed to have command of the sea, aren't they?
Yes, John, but that, of course, assumes that the British have done nothing. The general staffs, of course, are not revealing their plans. Official statements indicate that the Allies have agreed on certain concerted action. Just what that action is has not been made public. What is known is that the British fleet has engaged some German naval units. But the fact that the Germans have occupied all of the important ports of the Norwegian coast seems to indicate that the British have done nothing, that is, nothing of importance, or with any success, since the Germans have occupied strategic positions.
Mm-hmm.
Your question, John, is a question which is being asked by millions everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
But until some official answer is given, or at least until a few days have been allowed to lapse, many here are waiting, believing that perhaps Allied strategy is aiming at some yet unrevealed move, and that German action had been expected to take the form it did.
Mm-hmm.
On the face of present events, it seems incredible that the Germans could move so quickly and unhampered to achieve what they had achieved.
Yes, well, Bill, that answers what was to have been my next question. That is, wasn't the possibility of severe German retaliation anticipated when the Allies laid that minefield? But I think you've really already answered that question, unless you'd like to add a word about it.
Well, I'd like to add just this one word, John. That
Please.
German retaliation was anticipated, and not only anticipated, but hoped for. This
really?
war has been, so far, a search for some means of inducing the Germans to...
Hello?
Ladies and gentlemen, in New York City, in our studios with Mr. Gunther, we regret that our signal from Paris by shortwave has been interfered with in some technical manner, and that for the moment we cannot hear Mr. Hillman. We shall try to raise Paris again. Mr. Gunther, will you
Hello,
call
everybody.
Mr. Hillman?
We've suddenly been interrupted. I was talking to Paris, to Bill Hillman in Paris, and the circuit was cut as I was asking Mr. Hillman a number of questions. Whether the circuit will be resumed or not, we don't know.
Hello, John.
Hello, Bill. Good.
Here we are.
Yes, righto.
Well, what I was saying is that
yes.
one of the problems is was to induce the Germans to abandon, as you put it, the Sitzkrieg for a Blitzkrieg.
That's right.
The main problem is the German supply of oil.
Yes.
As long as Germany sits quietly on the Western Front, little of our oil is used up. But once Germany is forced to extend her positions to fight and to maintain certain strenuous activity,
right,
those precious tons of oil are being used up.
That's right. That's right. Now, but let me proceed, Bill, to another question. It's a hypothetical question, but a question that may become very real soon. If the Germans do manage to entrench themselves in Norway along the whole coast, what can the British do?
Well, John, that's a very serious problem that they will have to face. Of course, it's difficult under present conditions to say anything at all about Allied military plans or strategy.
Of course, I understand that.
Undoubtedly, you will find increased aerial activity because since the German frontier is literally extended towards England,
yes,
the air activity will become very intense.
Right. Well, now, that, of course, leads directly into another question that is of absolutely burning interest to everybody in the United States today. That is, do you think that the British could, if they wanted to, land an actual expeditionary force, that is, infantry, etc., if the Germans hold the Norwegian ports? In other words, how could they land an infantry force through those barren fjords if the Germans already hold them and arm them with machine guns and so and so? Or, this gets back to what you said, Bill, will they realize that an expeditionary force is extremely difficult or perhaps impossible and rely only on the sea and the air? I know that's an awfully difficult question to ask offhand, but I can tell you that practically 90 million people in the United States are burning to hear some kind of point of view about it.
Well, John, on that question, I'm afraid that I'm not even allowed to guess.
Mm-hmm.
But I can say certainly that sea and air attacks may be expected.
Right. Good. Well, that leads up to my next question. We've heard tonight, Bill, all over America that a great naval battle is in progress between the British and the Germans. By that, I assume, I have no actual knowledge, but I assume that the British are attempting to cut off the return of the German ships that acted bringing transport, bringing men, etc., to Norway, barring their return back to Germany. Now, do you suppose that the British Navy is really doing a good job now in intercepting these German supply and troop ships back to their bases in Germany?
I think your assumption is pretty correct. There is no official information on it, but I think you will find that your outline is as near as we can get to the facts of the present moment.
Right. Well, now, Bill, I'm going to skip another question that I had in mind because we've really already covered it, And I want, just for a minute, we have only a minute or two left, to turn to another field. We've heard a lot today here in America about German demands on the Baltic states, the Germans asking for the right to patrol the Danube from Bratislava right to Constantinople. Now, if the Germans should attempt some sudden movement in the Balkan area, are the Allies planning to counteract that maneuver in any way?
Well, John, that will entirely depend upon where the move of aggression will take. I don't think the Allies are in any position yet to undertake any military action until they know, that is, unfortunately, until they know just where the drive or aggression takes place.
Right. Well, now, I want to ask another question, which may seem a little bit pressing in view of what you've just said there, and I know it's very difficult to talk freely, but there's been a lot of talk here about the possibility of a Russian attack in taking advantage of the general confusion toward Bessarabia. Is any word of that known in Paris?
Nothing is known of it officially or unofficially, but the belief is certainly that Russia will not attack Bessarabia or make any move except in conjunction with Germany, because the whole picture as it unfolds itself today in Norway, following the recent Finnish business and following the Russian-German division of Poland, is that Europe is being cut up like a piece of, or like a pie, each piece being handed to Germany at one move and a piece being handed to Russia at the next.
Yeah. Well, now, one final question, or rather a final question on this list, then I want to ask you something else. Have you heard anything about something that all Americans are interested in, the position of the Scandinavian kings? We're getting back to Scandinavia again. Here's old Håkon in Norway, who's 68 and who's ruled since 1907. Here's old Christian, who's 70 in Denmark. They're brothers, you know. What are the Germans going to do with those kings? Have you heard anything at all about that?
Well, John, the only information here is restricted to a very cynical remark that these royal heads can either become puppet kings under German protection, or they can take their exile in England.
Right. Well, now, Bill, we have about 28 seconds left, and I want to ask you one other question. It's awful to ask it to you in such a short time. Have you anything very recent from Paris that you wish to report yourself?
No, I'm afraid not, except this one thing, that I think you have correctly and rightly stressed the very grave situation which has developed.
Right. All right. Thank you, Bill Hillman. Thank you very much. Good night.
Thank you, John. Good night, John.
Good night.
You've just heard John Gunther here in New York discussing the tense situation in Europe with William Hillman of Collier's, now in Paris. Now, for the latest news in Washington, let's listen to
Mortgage talking from Washington, where diplomats and officials and just common ordinary people are pondering over those very problems and those questions that you've heard Mr. Gunther and Mr. Hillman discuss across the ether waves. They're also wondering another thing. Are two more foreign legations going to be forced to run up the red flag blazoned with a swastika and then lock their doors? Well, at present, no such plans are known here. Officially, Norway and Denmark are merely under the beneficent protection of the Reich. The Norwegians, however, seem to chafe a little bit under that protection. And up at the attractive legation late this evening, a little beyond the great embassy of Great Britain out there on Massachusetts Avenue, a message was received. A message from somewhere in Norway. We don't know where. And this is the way it reads. The Norwegian Parliament and government left Oslo early this morning for Hamar, which will be the new seat of government. Before leaving Hamar, Foreign Minister Halvdan Koht stated that he was visited at 5 o'clock a.m. today by the German minister, who in a written statement, as well as by word of mouth, expressed the opinion that Norway should not resist, but submit to German military administration. The foreign minister presented the German note to the full cabinet, which had been sitting overnight. The cabinet unanimously decided that it could not accept the German proposal. The Germans, said Dr. Koht, excused themselves by saying they were forced to do this in order to prevent Great Britain and France from doing the same thing. But, the Foreign Secretary added, and this is a strange postscript to an official communication, but we place no confidence in that. A general order for mobilization has now gone out. And tonight, too, Henrik de Kaufmann, Minister of Denmark, held a conference in his legation. And he said that he, at least, would refuse to represent a German-dictated Danish government in the United States. I represent Denmark and its king in this country, he said, and nobody else. He charged Germany with violating the non-aggression treaty in force between the two countries, with the overturning of all international laws. We interpreted. Those were his words. And then he read a sentence from Article 1 to the men that were gathered about him there of that treaty. It reads, "The Kingdom of Denmark and the German Reich will in no circumstances resort to war or to any other form of violence against each other." And then he went on to say that he had received no communication himself of any kind from his government, but that he and every other Dane hopes and is convinced that the present Nazi occupation is, as Berlin has claimed, temporary and to last only for the duration of the war. And then, about a little over an hour ago, President Roosevelt's special train arrived here at the Union Station. He was met by Undersecretary of State Sumner Welles, first Cordell Hull, then the Undersecretary, Mr. Wells, and Assistant Secretary of War, Mr. Johnson, too. Whether the presence of a member of the War Department was accidental or premeditated or merely a matter of courtesy, anyhow, it gave a military touch to the occasion. The three officials proceeded at once to the White House. On their minds, too, were these very problems. First, of course, the status of these three countries. As officials and members of Congress recovered from the shock of the news that they had learned last night from their radios or early this morning in the newspapers, the comment gradually began to take on a little political tinge. And that's natural enough. For from the first, the third term question has been closely bound up with the European situation. The burden of the comment on the war expressed the same determination that America must keep out. Some of the men in Congress, both senators and representatives, seemed alarmed lest the conflict might spread further and thus might force us in too. Later on, the question of the effect on the president's plans were frankly broached. On the former question, Chairman of the House Committee on Foreign Affairs, Saul Bloom, said, "There is not a vote in either House or Senate for America's entry into this war." The third term supporters, when they made comment, seemed to feel that their cause was strengthened, for they recalled to our minds the fact that the one condition upon which it was generally accepted the president would accept the nomination was a situation abroad which verged on an emergency. Of course, the president himself had nothing whatever to say on that subject. Earlier in the day, he had had a press conference on his train on the way to Washington, and he made one remark that some felt might have some significance. He said that what had happened in the last 48 hours had brought home what the potentialities of war in Europe might mean to America. Some considered that was a reference to the need of a strong national defense program, for the president earlier said that he thought the situation which existed today in itself rose above the consideration of any individual. Meanwhile, of course, some of his questioners were thinking about what was happening out in the Illinois primaries, where the president's slate was running well ahead of Vice President Garner's. America, of course, has another stake in this latest move of Germany's, a $200 million stake, at least according to the figures that we have here. For American investments in Denmark and Norway run to about this amount. Of course, the effect on the securities will depend once again on that same question that I mentioned earlier. Just what will be the status of the invaded countries? In the case of our other European conquests, the Nazi government's usual custom was to permit a certain amount of restricted liquidation of some direct foreign investments, but then to cease interest payments on the bonds of the conquered nation. Alarming as the situation seems to be to some, and pessimistically as Mr. Gunther seemed to feel that it was, especially taken in connection with the rumors that we're hearing here, too, that the Germans may attempt a similar move in the Balkans or in Holland, nevertheless, military and naval experts point out there are certain rifts in the Nazi lute, and perhaps another side, after all, of the picture. Because here and there a ragged edge shows that seems to indicate that the so-called blitzkrieg may not have come off quite in accordance to all of the careful planning which, as Mr. Hillman said, was evidently recognized there and certainly was here. A naval battle now, at this moment, as was mentioned, is raging or has been raging off the Norwegian coast. And the British have already predicted good news from their fleet. We've heard the rumors that the Bremen, that prize of the German maritime fleet, and now used as a transport, had been torpedoed. We haven't confirmation of it yet. But there isn't any evidence that the Norwegian ports which were mined by the British have been penetrated by the German forces or were from without. And that sweeping aerial curtain of bombs which was to be dropped from German planes to shield the German ships carrying men and supplies up the Norwegian coast seems to at least have been torn in some places. And so, some people feel, as Mr. Gunther hinted as an alternative, that perhaps this shot in the north on the part of the Nazis might be a boomerang. Of course, it must have bolstered German morale. But then a naval victory, of course, would be a boost for British morale, too. Military experts knew of the German plan of a possible invasion, just as the Allies did, according to what Mr. Hillman said. And there was talk here of the mining of neutral waters by the Allies more than a month ago, more than that. And at that time, it was not discussed as retaliation or a move of protection. But before that even, while the war in Finland was going on, it's pointed out that German soldiers were being trained in the practice of embarkation and debarkation. And that's the reason that the same question is raised here that Mr. Gunther raised. Why, if the Allies knew that, they did not make some more effective step earlier. The mining of those coastal waters in Norway, late as it came, was not too late, apparently, to force some of the German ships far out from the sheltering land. We know that at least one was put at the mercy of the British. The troop ship Rio de Janeiro sunk yesterday, and perhaps now the Bremen has had the same fate. It's much more difficult, of course, to sight a ship when she's hugging the land. And such mines as there were naturally forced the German ships out into clearer visibility. That's what the experts say. And, of course, military and naval experts here have been wondering about what the next step would be. Will the Allies land forces in Norway? Well, it's not expected. It's a possibility rather than a probability, they say, because they know that the Germans could get more men there quicker than the Allies could. And then when the battle was fought, it would still be just another beginning. Except, of course, as was pointed out, an Allied victory might mean the cutting off of the valued iron ore. And the negotiations with Sweden, of course, are pointing toward the husbanding of such a source. Late dispatches say that the Germans have asked for a statement of strict neutrality and cooperation. Well, it's very difficult to say from this long distance, of course, what the next step could be. It was known the Germans were confident that they could reach and destroy communication lines in Norway if the Allies tried to land forces in Finland. And that was supposed to be something that would hinder the progress and perhaps stop the expedition then. Well, that's about all that we can tell. Here we feel, as everyone else does, that we're only looking into the dark. We can't tell yet, for it's only the second act, the beginning of the second act in this second tragedy in our generation. That's all. Thanks very much, and that's all there is now from Washington at this time.
You've just heard another special broadcast on the present situation in Europe. Keep tuned to this station for the latest news. This is the National Broadcasting Company.